hear music until the host joins the meeting.
Everyone, this is Ingrid Lahman from the Corporate Leadership Council. I hope that you're doing well. Leah asked me to re-record a session that I presented to your colleagues on Monday, February 17. So why you're just going to be hearing me doing a voiceover of some of the teaching points I shared with them across the course of that presentation. What unfortunately you won't be able to hear is some of the commentary that your peers across GAP provided when it came to some of the succession management insights and concepts that we shared with them. But hopefully this will give you a good understanding of what was discussed, of what was covered in the meeting on Monday morning of February 17. Without further delay, let's actually focus on the first page. You'll see that I serve as the executive advisor for the GAP, and what that means is I'm typically the person that will present our research findings to any team member at the GAP. I'm also the person that can point you to the most relevant resources, the most relevant insights to help you with any of the HR issues or challenges or projects that you're working on. So just a quick introduction for me when it comes to that. So let's actually begin with the bulk of the conversation. You know, the topic of succession management is not a new topic for CLC to cover. If you are at all a longtime CLC user, you're probably familiar with some of the older succession management work that we've done. In that older succession management work, we talk a lot about mitigating risks, and there are 4 specific risks that we ask organizations to guard against. The first risk is vacancy risk. So when a leadership position comes up, you don't have a person that's ready to assume the role. The other risk is readiness risk, or what I like to call development risk. Your development investments aren't paying off, and you find that successors that you've identified aren't ready to assume the positions that you've designated them for. The other risk related to development risk or readiness risk is transition risk. So for the positions that you have to hire externally for, you find that they're not doing a good job of getting up to speed in their new role as quickly as possible. And then last but certainly not least, we have portfolio risk. And that's really risk of placing a leader or deploying a leader to a part of the organization where the organization is not going to get a good return on its investment. You know, it's not good for the business, and it's not also good for the individual development of that leader. Now, in 2013, our research team had an opportunity to conduct a new study on succession management. And when we had the opportunity to talk to hundreds of HR executives around the world, when we talked about succession management with them, the most frequent word that people use to describe their succession management efforts is the word pipelines. And we're going to discover very quickly across the course of the conversation today if pipelines are broken, and are broken in several different ways and several different reasons. And what you're also going to hear me say across the course of the presentation is this. We need to shift our approach to succession management. Instead of taking a pipeline management approach, what we're advocating organizations to focus on is a portfolio management approach. And we're advocating a portfolio management approach because we want organizations to be flexible, to be adaptable, when it comes to their succession planning efforts. What bench of leaders that they have, those people need to be ready to assume roles that exist now, but also if those roles change in importance, if those roles change in the future, and new roles come up, we want that bench of leaders to be able to flex, to adapt to the different business requirements and be able to assume those new leadership positions in the future. And if you don't agree with me right now, that's perfectly fine. I think I have roughly 75 minutes or so to convince you that some of the ideas that I'll be presenting to you are good ideas and potentially adoptable by the GAP. Further delay, I'm going to switch over to slide 3. And just so you know, if you're having a hard time seeing all of the detail within this particular deck, Leah also sent a soft copy of the presentation to everyone in the team that should have attended the session. So let her know that you'd also like a soft copy of the presentation deck, and we'll make sure that you get your hands on it. So I would start with just a little bit of background. I know that the font is a little bit on the smaller side. You'll have to pardon us for that. We like to jam as much information as possible on one single page. I thought that I would start here because if you recall from the cover page, the forum title of today's virtual briefing is Succession Strategies in the New Work Environment. And I want to make sure I'm being as crystal clear as possible on what I mean by new work environment. So starting 3 years ago, the research team here at CLC decided to understand how do organizations operate? How does work get done? And what we found is that how work gets done and how organizations operate has significantly changed in the last few years. Take a look at the information that you see here on the upper left where my red arrow is pointing. Just what country headquartered in, despite what industry you find yourself in, a lot of organizations have become much more geographically dispersed. So employees have to work with people in different time zones, in different cultures, and work in different customer segments, if you will, or work with different customer segments. I know that this is a concept not alien to Gap. I think that there was a shift in the company from a regional focus to a more global focus. Over upper right, what we've also observed is a lot more organizations have become matrix. So there are many implications when it comes to this particular data point. One very one is decision-making is not simple. Not that it was ever simple, but a lot more people involved in making simple decisions compared to what it was like a few years ago. Take a look at the information on the lower left. In order to get work done, there is just much more interdependency. There is just much more collaboration required to get a product or service out the door, so much more than 3 years ago. And then last but certainly not least, there is probably so much more information and data that we have to deal with to get work done. So this is our simple evidence, if you will, that the way that we operate, the way that work gets done has changed profoundly. So just looking at the information on this page, it should not be a surprise to any of you that leadership responsibilities, leadership requirements have also changed as well. And that is what you see on the next page. So I'm going to adjust it a little bit so you can see most of the information. And again, on the upper left, one of the most interesting data points that we uncovered is that HR actually has to create a good amount of leadership positions per year, right? So in total, or on average rather, there are about 14% of new leadership roles that HR has had a hand in creating. So what this is telling us is change is afoot. No matter what organization you find yourself in or no matter what industry you're in. If there is anything that you can count on, it is change, and that change is going to happen. And we see it here on the upper left. There are a lot more leadership roles that we have to create in order to get work done, right? And then take a look at the information on the upper right and on the lower left. Not only will leaders have to assume newly created roles, but even if they in the same role, those roles probably will change pretty quickly, right? That's what you see there on the upper right. There are changes that happen to roles every 2 years, more or less, and that's actually increased. And then if you take a look at the information on the lower left, not only will your role change frequently in terms of the things that you have to do, but generally speaking, leaders in this new work environment have more responsibilities than ever before and a wide range of responsibilities to boot. And then last but not least, this requires a little bit of explanation, but as a leader, your job is much more complex and much more tough than ever before because you have to help your team members develop what we call enterprise contribution. Enterprise contribution is our new definition of performance here in CLC. So be an enterprise contributor. You need not only to do your job well, which is hard enough, but you also need others to help you do your job much more effectively. You need them to provide you with tips, tactics, support, and guidance on how you want to do your job well. And you also have to exchange information with colleagues and share tips, tactics, and guidance on how they can do their jobs well. So leader, you need to encourage and enable your team members to help others get their work done. But what it also means is that you also have to rely on others to help your team get work done. So all different points of evidence that show that as a leader, leadership requirements, leadership responsibilities are ever changing. So I presented this information to you. Again, it should not be a surprise that as our leadership requirements change or frequently change changes you can see here, so our understanding of what constitutes a strong leadership bench. And that's what you see over on the next page. Now, I think this is a little bit more simpler, less busy. I think it's one of the more important pages, so I'm probably going to spend a little bit of time here. Think about having a strong leadership bench. We tend to think through the lens of what you see here on the left, continuity. So we know we have a strong leadership bench when we have a pipeline of leaders that are able to assume leadership roles that exist now. That's what we mean by continuity. We have capacity, or the capacity rather, of a leadership bench to fill gaps in existing leadership needs. Now, the other thing that we're encouraging member organizations to think about is not just about continuity, but about optionality. In an age where change is your constant, if you will, we need to redefine our definition of bench strength. It can't just be about ensuring continuity, but we also have to ensure optionality. And by optionality, we mean that whomever we choose as a successor has the flexibility, has the adaptability to assume new leadership positions as they arise, or be able to assume leadership positions as they change frequently. So we need our leaders who are in our bench to be able to ensure continuity, but we also need them to be flexible and adaptable to ever-changing business needs that might require a different type of leader, a different set of responsibilities. So hopefully this is one of the big ahas here. I think conceptually no one disagreed with what you're looking at here, but there's widespread acknowledgement among GAP team members that you're probably thinking a little bit more around the lens of continuity rather than the lens of optionality. And if you're interested in understanding some of the detail behind these two boxes, just look toward the left of the page. These are different metrics that help you understand what we mean by continuity and what we mean by optionality. And again, two are very different from one another. Continuity is about filling positions that exist now. Optionality is being able to flex your leadership bench to be able to fill new leadership positions as they arise, and just being able to adjust your bench to change within roles. So that's one of the biggest ahas that hopefully you're taking away from the page. Now we're going to skip slide 6 simply because I don't have anyone to facilitate group discussion with, but you'll have a good understanding of some of the questions that I post to folks on Monday morning. Let's actually take a look at the current state, which is what you see captured here on slide 7. The way we got this information, since I'm not going to go through survey methodology with you, is we had an opportunity to survey hundreds of business leaders in about 50 organizations around the world, and they were spread across about 200 business units in total. What we found, or what we asked them rather, is we asked them to assess the relative strength of their leadership bench based on continuity and based on optionality, and this is what they told us. If you take a look at the leftmost bar, which is where we're going to focus our time today, it is very clear to see that when it comes to the definition of leadership bench with both continuity and optionality embedded in that definition, most organizations or most leaders would say that use that definition of leadership bench strength, that I would say our leadership bench is weak. That's what you see there. 73% of business units or divisions told us that their leadership benches were weak when you use the lens of continuity, when you use the lens of optionality. Only 27% of business units or divisions we had an opportunity to survey said that they were actually strong in terms of a leadership bench perspective when it comes to continuity and when it comes to optionality. And again, this is not a big surprise. We don't always think about the lens of optionality. We primarily think through the lens of continuity. Actually see on the next page what you get if you focus on these two types of bench strength. So let's focus first on the top half of the page. What we're essentially doing here is comparing revenue growth and profit growth. We're comparing those two things across two organizations or two types of organizations, those with a weak bench and those with a strong bench. And again, weak bench and strong bench is determined by business leaders and using continuity and optionality as their lens. So what's clear here is if you have a weak bench, specifically take a look at the upper left, your revenue growth is only about half as strong as those with a strong bench. Now take a look at the upper right this time. If you have a strong bench, you can achieved twice the year-over-year profit growth of organizations with weak benches. So, a very compelling business case, if you will. It's important to ensure that our succession management efforts focus on ensuring continuity and optionality as well, because when we enjoy or when we have a strong bench, we see higher year-over-year revenue growth and a higher year-over-year profit growth, if you will. And the reality is that if you have a weak bench, you have to keep on going outside to be able to fill leadership positions, right? And what happens is, for most organizations, while it's realistic to have to do executive hiring even with effective succession planning efforts, a lot of organizations find themselves having to go outside more than ever before. And that's what you see here on the bottom left. I know that the font is pretty small, but the target in terms of the percentage of executive positions to be filled externally is about 24%. That's pretty realistic. What's happening in reality, though, is a lot of organizations have to go outside more for executive positions. So for most organizations, they actually fill 38% of their leadership positions with external hires. And not only will that be expensive for the organization in mind, right, but also going to be, not so optimal, if you will, is the fact that people who are externally hired tend to have a higher failure rate. We looked at this topic many times here in CLC, and we generally say that 50% of the time, somebody that you hire externally, specifically an executive, will fail. They will leave the organization. If they don't fail, take a look at the information that you see here on the bottom right. It's going to take them just a little bit longer, specifically twice longer, to get up to speed in their new role compared to someone who was an internal hire. So lots of challenges if you have a weak bench. You don't get to enjoy as great revenue growth, as great of a profit growth. You have to hire more externally. You have to spend more money to do that. You are exposing yourself to a high failure rate in terms of executives. And then even if they don't fail, it's going to take them a long time to get up to speed in their new role. Now, it is no surprise, given all of the information that I shared with you, that succession management is important to every organization that we speak to, right? What's actually really interesting is if you take a look at the next page, there is a lot of time that is being spent on succession management. So without the evidence that I showed you earlier, people recognize it's important, and they're putting a lot of time, energy, and effort to make succession management work in their company. So to look at the left side of the page, what we're showing you here is how much time is spent on formal and informal succession activities by two parties, by business leaders themselves and by HR leaders, right? So one of the interesting things that Rob had brought up when we showed him this page is, number one, leaders are spending about 182 hours each year on succession management, which is insane, right? And he expects, like we do, that even though senior leaders are devoting time to succession management activities, they're probably focusing it on those activities that, or aren't just as impactful to ensuring a strong bench as some other activities. So to give you an example, they're probably spending a lot of time participating in a talent review, right? Showing up, if you will, maybe talking about their talent, but really should be spending more time is on some of the things that you see here at the bottom of the page, helping create a development plan, having informal discussions about direct reports' performance potential or what their development areas are. So the thing to take away from the left of the page is whether you're looking at HR or the business, you're spending a lot of time and money on succession planning. And so it's important that we get a good return on our investments. But I saw earlier, there are a good percentage of organizations out there with pretty weak benches. And if you take a look at the pie chart on the upper right, what we uncovered is that, 28% of leaders are currently leaders now in organizations we surveyed. Only 28% of them were actually part of some formal succession plan or succession management plan. So we're spending all of this time on succession management, as you saw on the left of the page, but our rate or our success rate is not very good, as you can see here. And I think both HR and business leaders, if you take a look at the bottom right, recognize that it's time for our succession management efforts to change. Whether you're looking at HR or whether you're looking at senior leaders, there's only a small percentage of them that would agree, or only a small percentage of them, rather, that are satisfied with current succession planning efforts. So what we're going to do is just skip a few pages, if you'd mind. I'm going to skip the survey methodology. I'll have you look at that yourself. But what you wanted me to do is to spend as much time on the next few pages. So why aren't we getting a good return on our succession planning investments? It's not a lack of time or lack of effort, if you will, but we're obviously not focusing our succession management efforts on the right things. We have, benches based on our new definition of bench strength, and then we also don't have a good hit rate. There's a small percentage of leaders that are part of some formal succession planning effort, and you're probably wondering, where's everyone else gone? That's a really good question. Let me show you why we think succession management efforts aren't going well. And according to CLC research, there are four main problems with our pipeline approach. The first problem is what you see here on the bottom left. A lot of times when we do succession planning, sometimes we're doing succession planning efforts for a position that's going nowhere. It's probably going to be sunsetted by an organization because it's not as important, and still devoting time and energy to identifying successors, preparing successors, and managing successors. So the first break in our pipeline approach when it comes to succession management is pipelines to nowhere. So to throw out some statistics to you, about 18% of leadership positions were eliminated last year, and 31% of senior leaders told us they are in brand new positions. So that shows you that, like you could imagine, the business is dynamic. It's ever-changing, and that has an implication on the leadership positions we focus succession planning efforts on. Let's take up the next, narrow, leaky pipelines. So part of the problem we face with succession management is we're working with a small pool, and that's not a big surprise because not everybody is successor or high potential quality, right? But for a typical organization, the people that we're working with that are high potentials or successors are about less than 10% of their workforce. And what we also found is not only are we working with a very small pool, that pool tends to leak, right? We lose people because we lose them to a competitor. They don't want to be a senior leader anymore. They're not engaged with the company anymore. So various reasons people leave out of our pipeline, and that's a problem for succession planning efforts. Let's look at the third break, which is clogged pipelines. I think this is one of those breaks that every organization really attached to. Clogged pipelines is essentially people who are high potentials or successors don't see much upward opportunity for them. They, or HR says, or the business leader says that they will get to assume a lot of interesting positions and get exposure to a lot of interesting experiences in the future. For several reasons, we don't follow through on our development commitment. And they think that the pipeline is clogged. They have nowhere to go up. And so we might actually lose them. So that's what we mean by clogged pipelines. And then last but not least, over on the very bottom right, we have rusty pipelines. Rusty pipelines simply refers to the fact that the people that are currently in leadership positions right now are not a good fit for the company's direction. They might have been a good fit when you identify them as successors in the past, but because the business has changed tremendously, they are no longer a good fit for the future. The problem with succession planning is our efforts really end each time we put a successor in the position. We think we're done. We wash our hands of them, if you will. We're advocating here, and you'll see that in greater detail in just a second, is that succession planning can't end when you put a successor in seat. You have to continuously recalibrate your leadership positions or your leadership talent to make sure they are the best fit for the organization. So what I'm going to do is just give you additional color on each of these breaks, and then we'll talk about how we need to shift from a pipeline management approach to a portfolio management approach. Hopefully all of this will make sense. So let's go to the next page really quickly and start with pipelines to nowhere. So some of the evidence on the left of the page you're already familiar with, but let me just share it with you very quickly. 13% of C-suite positions in organizations we surveyed were eliminated in the past year. Over on the bottom pie chart, what we also found is for the senior leaders that we surveyed this year, 31% of them told us that they were in brand new positions, newly created positions. So that's actually interesting. Evidence that the business that we're in, the environment in which we operate, the industry that we're in is ever changing, right? And so again, business demand or business strategy shifts, business goal shifts, so will our talent and leadership needs shift. And we need to make sure our succession planning efforts are able to understand how demand for leadership talent will change in the future. Over on the very right, you just see examples of roles that we either eliminated or were actually created. So I'll leave you to look at that in your own time, but some pretty interesting positions that were created and some interesting ones that were eliminated. Let's the next break in the pipeline. Next lines. Here where the font is really small, but I hope you find the information both alarming and interesting and a good call to action. So let's just take a look at this pie chart that I'm circling around very quickly. What essentially all of the dark pie slices are telling you is about less than 10% of a typical workforce high potential or successors. And that's not a big surprise. Not everyone can be successors. Not everyone could be considered high potential. You know, if you the CLC model for high potential, we say you got high performer, you have to have ability, you have to have a high level of engagement, and you also have to aspire to leadership roles. There's a lot that's baked into what constitutes as someone with potential. So not a big surprise that we're working with a small pool of people. But here's where the problem lies. It's what you see toward the bottom of the page. Did some back-of-the-envelope calculation, we came to the understanding that you're going to lose a lot of people in your high potential and successor pool. If you take a look at some of the information toward the middle and bottom of this box, you'll find that, we'll lose a certain number of high potentials because we didn't quite identify their ability as correctly as we can. So about a small percentage, 7%. Some will lose because they'll lose aspiration. For reasons they decide, I don't want to be a senior leader anymore. So we lose 2% of high potentials because of low aspiration. We also lose a good percentage of our high potentials, specifically 25%, to our competitors. And that's just the reality of the world that we live in. Things are hyper-competitive, right? And they'll also lose a very small percentage of hypos. They had to leave the organization involuntarily. Maybe they're not performing well or for various reasons, what have you. But in total, what we found is that within that small pool that we're starting with, we're going to lose about 55% of high potentials or successors for various reasons, if you will. So the implication here is we have to rethink how we source high potentials and successors. Instead of maybe identifying people earlier in their career, maybe take a broad sourcing approach where we look at maybe obvious candidates and have them be successors. It might just bode better. Eventually, we will lose people anyway, so better to start with a broader, wider pool, if you will, and really make sure that we're leveraging their development. But I'll comment on more of that later. Let's actually take a look at clogged pipelines. Now, one of the most simplest pages here, but I think one of the more powerful ones. What essentially this is telling you, whether you're thinking about a successor or whether you're thinking about a high potential, both parties or both stakeholders don't have a very positive perception of upward mobility or upward opportunity in their company. So 75%, I'm just kind of doing average here very roughly, about 75% of successors and high potentials are either neutral or disagree with a statement that there are plenty of opportunities to move up the organization. Now, it could be that we're just not doing a good job of deploying people across and up the company. The reality is that, there are still leaders in positions right now, and those high potentials and successors cannot assume those positions. So what we need to do, if you take a look at the bottom of the page, is begin to shift the expectations of high potentials and successors. They can still have a very rich development experience by moving laterally, sometimes even moving downward, because those are critical experiences that they're getting exposure to that can aptly prepare them for different types of leadership positions that they could assume in the future. And I'll comment on more of that on more on that later, but that's our thinking regarding clogged pipelines. And another refreshingly simple page on 18, or page 18, rusty pipelines. Because we've done work on succession management in the past, we were able to kind of compare over a 10-year time period how responses to the same questions have changed. And that's really what you see here. This is a question that we pose to HR leaders, and we ask them if they would replace members of their senior leadership team if given the opportunity. Now, back in 2003, only 12% said yes. But interestingly, in 2013, that number has risen to 32%. And again, you just have to think about some of the information that I shared with you earlier. We are living and working in a new work environment, right? And sometimes the people who would be perfect successors may not end up being the perfect successors, especially as business conditions, business goals, and priorities change over time. Because with that, our leadership priorities will change as well. Someone that might have been a good fit in the past might not be a good fit in the future. So to quickly sum up the breaks in our pipelines, we have pipelines to nowhere, we have narrow and leaky pipelines, we have clogged pipelines, and what you see here are rusty pipelines. I'm going to skip the next few pages. They just kind of show additional evidence on why we need to shift our succession management efforts. But let me go to the heart of our thesis, which is you need to shift from a pipeline-focused approach to a portfolio management approach. So just bear with me for the next few pages, and then we'll get to some of the case profiles. So over on the left of the page is the current state. Over on the very right of the page is our desired state. So taking a look at each of these boxes by row, instead of focusing on supply-driven succession management, what we want you to do is to focus on demand-driven succession management. And I know many of you already understand that concept. I think maybe